So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio.
Are you an introvert or are you an extrovert? I know there's so much conversation about, well, it's about how you socialize or it's about how you recover. We're going to be unpacking a little bit more about understanding whether or not you're an introvert or extrovert. Maybe you learned something about yourself during COVID-19 and the quarantine that you need people more than you realized. Maybe you found a better balance of how much rest you need to be really present to others. This is actually really important because it will greatly impact our anxiety and even depression, but it will also impact our quality time that we do spend with others and perhaps even make us a little more aware of how other people function as well, and maybe kind of just accepting and giving them the space to be themselves. Sometimes I can tell you, as a real introvert, it can be a little difficult when you spend too much time around extroverts, which is fabulous. I love it. But if you can't recover for a minute, you're going to get grumpy, resentful, frustrated. You might not even be able to stand the other person. And just imagine if this happens within the context of marriage, and maybe you didn't quite know that you needed as much alone time as you realized. I remember that was a warning that one priest mentioned early on. Make sure you know how much alone time you actually need and that you communicate it. Anyways, we'll be diving into introversion versus extroversion a little later on in the show, and Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo will join us, and we're going to be talking about a study that came out last year in 2019. It's the largest data set yet having to do with people who have transitioned, who have decided there's something else other than their biological sex, and they want what used to be called sex change surgery. Now you often hear quote unquote gender affirmation surgery. Well, here's the deal. We're going to unpack that, even some of the language, but this large data set, it actually ended up being that the author and the editor were called out because the data set is phenomenal, but the author and the editor falsely highlighted information that made it sound like people who had cross-sex hormone therapy, and even more so, people who went through with a, say, surgery, a sex change surgery, that they were better off in terms of their mental health. That actually wasn't even what the study said, and they've issued a correction to the study. So we'll be unpacking some of that information with Michael Gasparo, because if you're like me, I want to be compassionate on this topic. I want to provide answers and solutions to people who are truly struggling with a gender identity disorder. Maybe that's a friend, a family member, someone you work with. We want to be compassionate and see that they're struggling. However, at the same time, we need to tell the truth. And we need, as a society, to provide solutions that won't harm or mutilate people. In fact, Michael Gasparo and I both spent Monday night giving a testimony in a public hearing having to do with sex change surgeries for minors here in California. We ended up calling in to the public hearing, heard in a Senate committee, to give our opinion on this bill in California. We'll share with you a little bit about that in just a little bit. But I want to talk about a topic I've been mentioning for a while that I wanted to discuss, and it has to do with exercising. This is so important that we cover. You see, so often I hear from people, and if you don't know this, I have a background in fitness. I taught Pilates for a number of years. I grew up dancing my whole life, ice skating, very active individual, and I have worked a lot in Pilates, which is not yoga, has nothing to do with yoga, isn't even similar. Be very clear. It has to do with your spine and your spine health and helping your spine to be in the proper position along with the rest of your bodily structure so that you can move better, live better, feel better. And so I work a lot with people who have had hip surgeries, spine surgeries, you name it, herniated discs, anywhere from their neck to their lower back, knee replacements. It's a form of, in a sense, physical therapy. And I have worked with people who have never exercised before and have taken it up for the first time, maybe even in their 60s and later, who developed the discipline of exercising. And this is important to me from a Catholic perspective as well, because so often we talk about the spiritual dimension of caring for our souls, spending that time in prayer each day, going deep in the spiritual life. But that can be kind of difficult if we're not really present in our bodies. If our bodies are aching with pain, sometimes even just pain from not having moved enough or stretched a little. And so the reality is that so much information shows that realistically we need at least 30 minutes a day of movement. I won't even call it exercise if that makes you feel a little bit better. I don't want to trigger you here. If you're sitting here going, okay, Timmery's telling me I need to exercise. We've got to start gentle. So I have a few questions. What are you going to do? Where are you going to do it? How are you going to do it, and when? I hope that this conversation will help you a little bit in finding answers to make a change, to get that 30 minutes a day of movement in. I think it starts with knowing, what will it be? What will you actually do? I mentioned this yesterday on the show, so I would never run. I'm sorry. You want me to run? It's not happening. You've got to be kidding me. First of all, knee problems, back problems, compression. Don't get me started with all my complaints about running, in addition to the fact that it just sounds awful and you get really winded. But a lot of people love running. They find it a very beneficial form of exercise for them. They love running marathons and having those goals. Maybe that's you. Maybe you need the goal of a marathon to exercise. Maybe you're a total gym rat, and if you show up at a gym, you will show up, stay there for an hour, hour and a half, maybe 45 minutes, and you'll get your exercise in. I'm not a gym rat either. I hate going to the gym. Maybe you're someone who would just love to get outdoors and kayak, or go for a hike, or maybe take a dance class, or even go walking with a friend or by yourself while you listen to your favorite podcast, Trending with Timmery, which you can find in your favorite podcasting app and at relevantradio.com/trending. Maybe you have always wanted to take a certain type of fitness class, perhaps Pilates. I know a lot of people who refer to those skinny people. I know some people are like, oh yeah, you teach Pilates, don't you? And I'm like, yeah. They're like, all those skinny you-know-whats take Pilates. Maybe I should consider it. I'm like, well, I am definitely an advocate for it. And if you have the opportunity, I really encourage you to try it out. So it's all about, what will you actually do? Do you know what interests you? And if you haven't, look for it. Because my best friend might love to run, but that's not me. It's not going to happen. And it's also important to keep into consideration age as well. We really do need at least 45 minutes a week of cardio, all of us, at least 45 minutes, but that doesn't mean you have to run or you have to do burpees. I know burpees just really suck. If you've never done a burpee, please do 10 and then let me know if you want to do them again if you are new to the burpees, because they're not fun. So it's all about knowing yourself. So my next question, knowing yourself, is, if you were to exercise, you've chosen a couple options for what might work for you, and maybe you even try it out. You might show up and try to take a Pilates class. I've had clients who have done this, and they and I both mutually agree this is not for you, because Pilates is something that really requires not just showing up and doing it, but really being mindful and aware of what you're doing, which muscles you're exercising, and getting into various elements of your muscles that you may have never felt before. And you may say, hey, it's a no for me, doc. And that's totally understandable. So whatever it might be, you need to know, where will it be? Will it be at home with a partner, in a gym if your state allows you to be at a gym? We're not really allowed to be in gyms here in California, unless perhaps you're sneaking in a back door. I know a few of you out there. I do. I've heard about it. I know it's happening. Or maybe you need to be somewhere where you will have competition. I know this can be really important for men in particular, to have someone where they're kind of feeding off of the energy of the other person, kind of feel like, okay, I'll size you up. I could do more than that. And maybe that's with a friend, or maybe it's just that you're sitting there kind of comparing a little bit while you're at the gym or in a particular class. I know some people who would love to be in a class together and be next to the person who they thought was really good or looked really fit, because it motivated them to keep going and not stop. These are just true things that people need. And sometimes I'll say men need more competition than women, but ladies, sometimes we need that competition too in order to get ourselves to exercise. And if you need that competition, home might not be the best option unless you're really going to try and compete with the person on that video and do more reps than the person or whatever it might be. So now the next question is, we know, what are you going to do? You've thought about it. Where are you going to do it? Well, how are you going to do it? Is it financially feasible? Are there changes that you need to make in your life, perhaps your schedule, like waking up a little earlier? Changing when you show up to work and maybe working out at a gym near your workplace where they have showers too. A lot of places actually have the opportunity for you to kind of get ready there in the morning, and maybe that'll shorten your morning commute by doing that. Sometimes we can actually save a lot of time on the road by just being a little more prepared in advance for when we'll exercise. Maybe it'll be with a stroller and pushing that stroller up a really, really, really steep hill to get a little bit of cardio in. I don't know, there's some really great stroller exercises online if you've not looked any of those up, ladies. I'm just telling you. And dads, don't be afraid. They are challenging. You can do it too. Just like Pilates is for men as well. Trust me, I worked with professional pro ball players, baseball players, and football players, and they need their Pilates. It's also what rehabs them after they've been really injured or prevents injury. That was key for me with dancing. Pilates helped to prevent injury for many, many years for me when I was really hard on my body. The other part of the question of how is, what sort of equipment might you need? I know everyone is having a hard time accessing equipment in the realm of COVID-19, home gyms, but keep an eye on different apps like OfferUp and Craigslist, because each day there's something new being kind of promoted, and it's not necessarily the same markup that was available yesterday. Because some people, do you know there's a huge business right now of people literally going and buying brand new fitness equipment and then upselling it like for 3 or 4 times the cost, and people are buying it because it's the only way they're getting their exercise in. So be ready to adapt to make that how happen. Make sure it's feasible for you, you have what you need, or maybe you're slowly building that home gym or signing up for those online classes. There's some really cool classes online and packages that you can do. So the final question is, when are you going to do it? The bottom line, schedule. If you don't schedule it in and make it a priority, it won't happen. And remember, it really does take some time to build a new habit. So give yourself 30 days of scheduling it in. Don't give up after a week or after a couple of days. I have some other tips for that. We'll have to recommend that later, of just trying to get yourself back onto a schedule or starting a schedule of exercising. Decide whether it's going to be in the morning or at night. Maybe you're going to split it up into 2 15-minute blocks a day. Or maybe when I was in college, a couple of things I did because I had so much reading to do, I probably read for like 8 or more hours a day. I would literally force myself to go to the gym, even though I wasn't a gym person, and I'd either take a book and ride the elliptical until I finished a certain assignment. That could be 40 minutes. It could mean an hour and a half. It was really challenging. Or maybe that was the only way I allowed myself to stop and watch Netflix for a minute. I could watch one episode, and the only way I got to watch that one episode is if I stayed on the elliptical the entire time. Couldn't come off, because at least I was getting some sort of exercise in, and it was when I took my break or was already doing something that I needed to be doing. So those are some tips for exercising and fitness. I hope it's helpful for you to dive in. If you have questions about fitness, I've worked for years in the fitness area, doing it on the side. I love taking questions, so feel free to send those in, because I'd love for you to see kind of those changes in your body and just being happier, less stressed, getting the endorphins that make us happy. As we know, Reese Witherspoon says in Legally Blonde, endorphins make you happy, and happy people just don't kill their husbands. So, joining me today on the show is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo, who joins us regularly on Wednesdays. If you have a question during the show, go ahead and give us a call. The number is 1-888-914-9149, or you can ask a question on my Instagram story. Just follow me at Timmery on Instagram. We would love to hear from you. I've posted a little question box online for you to just send those right in during the show. We're reconnecting with Michael here. I think we've got him again. But Michael is going to speak with me about this new data set. I mentioned it at the beginning of the show. We want to be a resource to people who are truly struggling over their gender identity, who are experiencing what is clinically referred to as gender identity disorder. And so Michael Gasparo works quite a bit with people who have experienced this of all ages. And I want to discuss this new data set, the largest yet, that has been corrected because it was telling lies about the mental health outcome of people who have gone through with sex reassignment surgery. The data was there, but the way they presented the information was a lie. Michael, please help us unpack this new study.
Hey, Timmy, can you hear me now?
We can hear you great.
Great. So as you mentioned, this large data set from the Journal of American Psychiatry, I think it's what it's called, is basically coming out, and they're reinterpreting the data and letting everyone know that outcomes for people who have sex reassignment surgeries, or what they're calling gender confirming procedures now, something along those lines, are not better. In fact, they're worse after surgeries, especially at the 10-year mark post-operation. And this is on top of the fact that the original data set was showing that hormone treatments, non-surgical interventions, were already non-beneficial and even harmful. So I'm running out of words, Timmy. My mind is blown. I don't understand what the confusion is. Even years of research done under the Obama administration was showing similar information, and the studies were showing that these kinds of gender-confirming surgeries, i.e. sex mutilation surgeries, and hormone interventions were not helping the mental outcomes of transgender identified individuals. So you and I are on the team of science, right? Science means exploring ideas and hypotheses through these double-blind studies or other kinds of studies. Let's look at the data and make informed decisions. And the data is clear. There should be no more confusion. These types of interventions, especially on minors, are unethical. They shouldn't be legal, and they're harmful.
And Michael, you're coming from the perspective who you work with people who struggle with this gender confusion in their life. And so I think that your expert opinion is so important because you've been knee deep. You've been up to the head in research having to do with this and providing solutions and real answers for people who are truly struggling. And this comes back to the issue of mental health. And so that's why it's frustrating for me to see that people just jump on, well, let's give this sex reassignment surgery, or let's give cross-sex hormones to children, not just adults, but to children, when this person is already clearly suffering from some form of a mental health disorder. In fact, I know you and I have both worked with Dr. Laura Haynes, who has been a guest here on the show, and she's a psychologist who often speaks to the fact that often there are multiple underlying mental health disorders for people who are struggling with gender identity disorder.
Absolutely. And what's really important to remember is that we are on the side of the well-being of children and adults who deal with gender dysphoria. And as Catholics, we love people as they are. But as people of good intent, of goodwill, we need to advocate for better solutions, helping them live in line with their biological reality, especially as children when they're vulnerable to ideologies that may confuse any underlying actual health issues beyond gender dysphoria itself. And we see these incredible rises in transgenderism in women, especially, which we've discussed before. And it's clear that this is being socially influenced. And if your listeners want to look to great Catholic medical research, there's another great Catholic pediatrician storming legislation named Dr. Michelle Cretella, who speaks frequently on this topic. As a pediatrician, she highlights that the interventions espoused by these kinds of studies, such as hormone or puberty blocking interventions followed by cross-sex hormones in adolescents, can lead to permanent sterilization of minors. Listen clearly, permanent sterilization of minors. That is not only unethical and immoral, but should not be legal in a just society. We don't even let minors get a tattoo, much less permanently disfigure their ability to either conceive children one day or even possibly experience sexual pleasure as adults, which is a gift from God. So we have to stand up for these children, most of whom, most studies show 90% or more will have a resolution of their gender dysphoria by adulthood without any intervention of any kind.
Right. And we're seeing studies that upwards of 90% of children, by the time they go through puberty, give it a few years, this gender confusion works itself out, even often without the intervention of mental health professionals. But also that requires that the parents, the school system, the counselors are ushering and coaxing that child into the gay or transgender community.
And a lot of the people, I think around 80% of people whose gender dysphoria resolves may identify later as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Okay, so that's something that person has to deal with and come to terms with, but they've not mutilated and permanently and irreversibly damaged their bodies as a result of early intervention that's not research proven to have.
Ooh, I think we lost Michael there. We'll get him right back and have him in a second. But one of the things that Michael just mentioned about the proven research with regard to really the mutilation of people are trying to call this sex affirmation surgery or gender affirmation surgery. That's a lie. I did an episode last year with a plastic and reconstructive surgeon, and he talked about what is top surgery. What is bottom surgery? And I have to tell you, there were a lot of visceral reactions to that episode that we did when we spoke about what actually occurs. What are we reversing, manipulating, chopping, removing permanently? And it reminded me of the reaction to abortion, about how people hate to see the truth of a visual image of a child who's been aborted, or to hear the story in detail of what happens to children who are aborted. We don't want to hear the same thing today in 2020 about the mutilation of children or adults through sex changes. This is not gender affirmation surgery. There's nothing affirming about it. And I believe Michael's back with us because, Michael, I want to talk about another dimension of this that you alluded to a moment ago. And that is that people who go through with the sex change surgery and the cross hormone replacement therapy, we start to see this unravels pretty quickly after. They're not happier. Their mental health declines. In fact, the study that came out last year that they were falsely reporting information on ended up making it very, very clear that actually anxiety increased for people who went through with a quote-unquote sex change surgery that mutilated their bodies. But what we do know, Michael, and this is what you mentioned, that at the 10-year mark, it's even worse. These people usually change their minds about what they went through. Can you speak more to this 10-year mark change and how we are in the midst over the last couple of years of just having gone through this kind of massive surge in sex changes, and we are yet to see the outcome of all these people who are claiming this is what would have made them happier?
The 10-year mark is an important first step, but then if you look past that to the 20, 30-year mark, suicidality just continued to increase higher rates. Hear me out. Higher rates than pre-surgery, and it just got worse and worse over 10, 20, and 30 years. So this is based off of this famous study out of Sweden anyway, and so we're talking about this data set where we're showing not only at 10-year mark did the suicide rates begin to increase, but then they just keep getting worse from there all the way to the 30-year post-operation mark. And what's important to remember is that we don't need a study for 30 years to understand that chopping off somebody's healthy sexual organs is going to impact them in a negative way. I think and I believe that reasonable people 150 years ago could have ascertained this through good conscience formation and awareness of morality in the world. So I do want to highlight that science is important, but we shouldn't be surprised by this information.
And to summarize this, what's so important to understand cross-sex hormones and so-called gender affirmation surgery, which is a sex change and a mutilation of the body, do not provide a better state of mental health. So it's not an answer for our loved ones who are struggling. And it's not the path of empathy to help them move forward.
Catholic professionals find purpose and take your career to the next level by experiencing Tepeyac Leadership Initiative. TLI is a 5-month experience, which you can access from anywhere in the U.S. Visit tliprogram.org to learn more. Turn your Catholic faith into the driving force in your career through professional development and spiritual growth. Go to tliprogram.org now. Be part of the next generation of Tepeyac leaders. tliprogram.org.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome back. If you have a question during the show, go ahead and give us a call, 1-888-914-9149. We'd love to hear from you and hear your questions, especially on this tough issue of gender. Let us know. Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo has joined us to discuss the importance of understanding that it's not just people of faith. It's not just people who hold to, quote unquote, a conservative, traditional, whatever you want to call it, worldview, who object to this radical gender ideology. In fact, someone who's been very popular in the news recently is actually a writer for Playboy. She's a neuroscientist and specializes in gender, sex, and sexual orientation. And she recently wrote the book, The End of Gender, debunking the myths about sex and identity in our society. Someone who we wouldn't really agree with on a lot of topics, actually. And yet at the same time, she is pointing out harmful dimensions of the fact that we are disconnecting biological sex from gender. Michael Gasparo, Associate Marriage and Family Therapist, is here with us. Michael, I'd love your keen insights and first reaction to Dr. Deborah Soh on gender.
Well, first caution to people who listen to her podcast. She does sometimes go to PG-13 levels of her discussion, but what's really interesting is she talks about basically exposure of testosterone in utero not only has to do with the development of masculine traits in the child, but it's a good reminder that biology is not about how you feel in the moment. So she really highlights that it's dangerous. She's actually pro-transgenderism per se for adults. If an adult wants to be transgender, she doesn't have an issue with that. But what's really fascinating is she highlights that for women with certain conditions where they're exposed to higher levels of testosterone in development in utero, they have certain more masculine traits, what we would associate as masculine traits in childhood. They'll maybe play with more masculine toys or get involved in more physical combat sports with other girls their age. So what's really cool about this is that we're highlighting a couple of the key points here. One, that gender expression is not totally random. Often we're hearing, well, gender's on a spectrum. No, she says gender's not on a spectrum. There are men and there are women. Then she talks about how you express yourself. Let's have a nuanced conversation about, do you express yourself with more typically masculine interests and ideas? If you're a girl, okay, well, we'll discuss that. But that's not going to negate the reality, the biological reality of men and women. And it's important because in this process, Timmery, we lose sight of the people who get harmed by this. Children are the ones being harmed when we deny biological reality because their minds have not been formed well enough to distinguish between some of these ideologies and the truth that they're trying to understand as they develop.
Michael, I love that we can see the fact that people who we don't agree with on various topics can still see clearly into topics such as these and provide key expert opinions and research, such as this neuroscientist, Dr. Deborah Soh. One of the interesting findings from what she has said is that one of her key concerns with separating gender from biological sex, which she says is impossible. There's no such thing. And we know as people who appreciate science and people of faith, it's incredible to see the complementarity between science and faith. Even in science, we know that there are literally sex differences written into every cell of the human body. And so with this in mind, this neuroscientist ends up commenting that she's incredibly concerned about the gender ideology's impact specifically on dating and sexual intimacy. She said this is playing a confusing part about how we interact in relationships, and it's actually putting particular pressure specifically on women to behave like men, to enjoy casual sex like men, and to participate in certain things that they normally wouldn't. And she also comments on how it's making many women feel uncomfortable and do things they wouldn't otherwise do. What are your thoughts on this impact on dating and relationships?
It's a really great question, because I have friends who even have had dating apps where they're not clear if the person that is identifying themselves as a female on the dating app is a biological male or woman. And it's so interesting because there's this message going around that you are transphobic if you're uninterested in dating a biological male if you are a heterosexual male. So in other words, if it's a trans woman, that you should be willing to date that person. But this is absurd. You can love people who have gender dysphoria, be kind to them, be compassionate, be respectful, and want to date a biological woman because you want to marry a woman who can have children and be a partner with you for life and marry let's say in the Catholic Church, for instance, where men and women can only marry one another. And so I think it is creating a lot of confusion, especially if children don't understand that the way you feel does not always have to dictate how you behave or how you interact with others. What if you just told them, well, if you feel angry and you want to hit them, you can just hit people? I mean, this trickles down into other areas of life. We have a lot of feelings or passions, as we call them sometimes in Catholic moral discussions, and we don't have to be dictated by them. And this is certainly going to create confusion for younger generations in the dating world, in my opinion.
Michael, another key dimension that's mentioned is that women want more of a work-life balance than men do. And yet, because we are always talking about this gender gap and career choices and women participating in STEM, it ignores real facts that the vast majority of women want a greater work-life balance, choose particular careers and timing in their career for this specific fact, but because there's such an intense and really rigorous gender ideology debate, it's putting a lot of pressure on women to ultimately act against their own nature to find that human balance that we're all called to.
Yeah, and she highlights that there are certain fields that are somewhat driven by testosterone exposure even as well. She mentions the STEM fields being more attractive to people who have higher levels of testosterone exposure in utero. I mean, I can't quote all of her research, but it's really fascinating. It's good to note, too, that disparities in professions exist across the board. I am in the marriage and family therapy profession, and most graduate programs for marriage and family therapy are 70 to 90% female. Does that mean that men are not allowed to be in those professions? No. It just means that there may be aspects of the way we relate as men and women that create a larger tip of the scale towards women being interested in that field than men. And that's okay. So why can't we just appreciate that there are some differences and that it's not necessarily a result of sexism or unfair, equitable outcomes are not always a result of lack of opportunity. They might result in just different interests.
It's so important. And this whole conversation about testosterone exposure in the womb, or even estrogen exposure as well for boys, there's a fascinating research that happened even back into the 80s and 60s with various types of anxiety medication that was actually impacting some, what we could say, effeminacy in men as grown adults because their mothers were taking these medications. And we even could talk about this, in relation to contraception and the hormonal imbalance that is very common among women who are having children today as a result of hormonal contraception for years in their exposure. Oh, I think we're having connection issues with Michael today. We are having devil in the details in terms of some of our guests this week with staying connected. We'll try to connect back to him. But I have to say, overall, when we separate babies from sex, when we take sex outside of marriage, there's a lot of ambiguity that occurs. Not only do we start with this abortion debate, do we suddenly, remove women from their motherhood and end up seeing the child who pays? Not only do men have lost a sense of fatherhood and identity in the culture, but there's this blurring of who we are as men and women. And I think that this separation of babies from sex and sex from marriage is why we've gotten to Obergefell versus Hodges back in 2016. Why we're now having this debate even about, well, what do you identify as? You have to come out as cisgender or whatever as a 13-year-old. It's because we have confused who and what the human person is.
Yeah, biology and God worked to help reveal. We know God made us male and female. And as people of faith, we are not taught to shut out or exclude our gifts, our faculties of reason. And we see that there are clearly, like all of these secular researchers are highlighting, two sexes, male and female. And that the beauty and the complementarity of that, as you mentioned, is what brings us to greater awe of our Creator. And that spiritual humility will help us to treat others with compassion even when they disagree, but not back down and not lack the courage to stand up against those who would undermine this basic reality which serves as a building block for healthy flourishing in a human society.
That's Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparo. You can find him at healingandpeace.com. Again, that's healingandpeace.com, where he works as a therapist for Healing and Peace Catholic Therapy Services. Isn't that great to see Catholic in the midst of therapy? In fact, you can even head over to catholictherapist.com as well, where Michael's also a member, to find people who will provide therapy services according to faith, not, encouraging lifestyles that are contrary to our goals and our belief in our Lord Jesus Christ and what he calls us to. We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmerie to talk about Kamala Harris, the new VP running mate, for Joe Biden. And we'll also talk about whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert and how this can decrease stress by knowing and increase quality time with others. We'll be right back.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Okay, I want to talk about Kamala Harris for a second here. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, a question came in on Instagram that I want to take. A really important question that we're not talking enough about. I've been sharing some of my fertility journey, especially last Friday on the show. You can go and listen to the podcast because my husband and I had a difficult time. It was a difficult start, and it requires a lot of faith, a lot of prayer and intercession in many ways, from health perspective with a medical treatment, but also from a religious perspective as well. And I'll be unpacking more of that tomorrow during our marriage hour to share a little bit about the first trimester that had its bumps along the way. And I want to talk about how it's important to find resources that are out there, that are available, and that we're sharing about them to help prevent miscarriage as it begins, possibly, to kind of be able to spot the signs and how to really help keep the mom healthy during pregnancy. But here's a question that came in just during the show. They said, do you have any information for male fertility issues? This is something we've not talked enough about on Trending. I've alluded to it here and there, but actually as female infertility increases, or just fertility challenges continue to increase, we're also seeing the same for men. And it's really interesting because it's something that, we always hear, men are fertile forever. It's not difficult for men to have children at any time. It's only women who have to think about their fertility. That's not really the case anymore. We're seeing the overall kind of degeneration of the human body right now where it's not functioning as it ought to. We could, attribute that to food, to lifestyle, lack of testosterone because of our lack of movement. For men, there's a lot that could be discussed, but here's a really great resource. I keep talking about NAPRO doctors, and I talk about them treating underlying health issues for women. But NAPRO doctors also work with male infertility issues as well. And so I highly recommend, especially if you're married and there's this struggle, to work with your NAPRO doctor, because usually the approach is to first start working with what might be going on for the woman in her fertility. But then as years go on, or should I not say years, but as time goes on, and there's still this struggle over fertility, there can be things done to figure out what's happening for men. And I'll never forget one of my first appointments. My NAPRO doctor, she gave this handout to help increase egg quality for women, to help support fertility, but also a lot of the same information applied to men, because sometimes we're just not getting what we need to help keep our bodies functioning happily and healthily. And so I really want to encourage checking out NAPRO doctors. We're going to post a link right now to a list of doctors where you can find a doctor who's a NAPRO technician who has incredible science and information to help unpack concerns with regard to fertility. So keep an eye out for that link right now on social media. We'll post it in just a moment here. You can follow me at Timmerie, that's Timmerie, on Twitter and Facebook, especially the Twitter. I want to talk now, before we dive into the introvert versus extrovert, what are you, about Kamala Harris. So former Vice President Joe Biden is running for president, if you didn't know, and he has chosen Kamala Harris from my lovely state in California and our horrible political system that is run really by hardcore pro-abortion advocates. And he's chosen Kamala Harris as his running mate. Now, I called this a long time ago. I said he's going to look for a woman. He's going to look for a woman who's radically pro-abortion, who's all about using terminology such as, quote, access for women, and who will not back down. Well, that is Kamala Harris. She is a bulldog fighting for unlimited, unfettered access to abortion, contraception. She's willing to hunt people down, to break into their homes, to do what she can to make sure that the narrative of abortion, the legalization of abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy, still stands, to make sure that there's no smear on Planned Parenthood's reputation. She's one of many who really helped to chase down and even break into the home of people such as David Daleiden to seize information and videotapes from the undercover investigations that he's done exposing Planned Parenthood, the Abortion Federation, and the greater abortion movement. This woman is the same one who, while serving for the California Attorney General, backed a bill and enforced a law that pro-life pregnancy centers that I was working for at the time here in California were forced to advertise for free and low-cost abortions to their clients. It goes directly against their mission, directly against the formation of their business. They're literally advertising for the competition or the opposition, as we could say. This is unprecedented. We had to have signs, large print signs inside of our facilities to say if we were a non-medical facility that basically discrediting, saying we know nothing that we're talking about and we have no sense of medical. Well, yeah, we're a pregnancy counseling center. We weren't even a medical facility, yet it was meant to scare women away. We couldn't even advertise on Facebook or Instagram without using this ridiculous terminology that promoted abortion before getting to what the crisis pregnancy centers do, and that is help women in crisis pregnancy. You see, Kamala Harris went after pro-life pregnancy centers by backing this bill and bringing it into law, but with her support. And I have to tell you, it's frustrating that we live in a time where we have to insist that there has to be a quota for a certain type of person, whether male or female, running on a presidential ticket, where we have to insist on this quota of race with regard to who's running for president as well. I think that this is what's sad, is sometimes we can kind of be moved into insisting that we back a certain type of person within a political party as our candidate to be all inclusive, but we're American. This is what we share. And we shouldn't be putting someone up there just because they're a woman or just because they belong to a particular race, but we should be propping them up because of what they stand for, what they're going to advocate for. And it's pretty disheartening to see the pro-abortion, the outright attacks against people who are pro-life, and even the anti-Catholic attacks that Kamala Harris has participated in. In fact, Kamala Harris suggested that Brian Buescher's membership as a Knight of Columbus would actually prevent him from hearing cases as a judge when he was being looked at to be elevated as a judge. And she said because he was a Knight of Columbus, because he was Catholic, he was ill-equipped, impartial, because of his religious and moral perspective. This is a woman who is pro-LGBTQ, transgender, everything. And yet we were just talking with Michael Gasparo about how being in favor of sex change surgeries or cross-hormone replacement therapies for adults or children doesn't bring out a happy end. It does not bring out greater sense of mental health and awareness. This is a major problem for Catholic voters. We are seeing anti-religion, anti-life, anti-family, and anti-truth ideologies being pushed from potential President Joe Biden and his running mate Kamala Harris. And I think that these are key things that we need to think about, ponder, and talk to others about as well. So to this topic of whether or not you're an extrovert or an introvert, I'd love to hear from you. Maybe you learned something about yourself during COVID. Maybe you found yourself just dying to get out there and spend more time with people. And maybe you suddenly think that because you want to spend more time with people, that you're actually an extrovert and never realized it. Well, let me tell you something. I'm actually a total introvert, which if we really look at the meaning, people think that, is it just that you love to be around people or that you don't love to be around people? It actually has to do with how you recover. How do you get your energy? Do you get your energy from being with people, from thriving and kind of drawing that energy from them? Or do you get energy from being by yourself, recovering? And not to say that people who are extroverted don't get energy by being by themselves, but they really thrive on the energy of others. Now, it's fascinating. So I'm a total introvert. I need that downtime. I need the quiet. I need to be alone to kind of recharge my batteries in a very, very intense way. But I found myself during COVID as kind of the interaction decreased. I started working from home 100% with COVID and launching this radio show. I wanted to be around more people. I missed people. I actually just wanted to go to the mall and walk around. And I don't even like going to the mall. I just wanted to see people because my batteries were so recharged. I had that alone time and that quiet that was present in my life that it wasn't that I was suddenly becoming an extrovert. It was that I actually was finding, hey, I'm getting the rest and recovery I need where I want to go out and see others. I'm not as maybe stressed out and overwhelmed by the presence of other people. I think that these are really important things to recognize. And maybe you discovered, though, or you're realizing you're an extrovert. That in order to be happy, in order to kind of have that energy, you need to interact with people. You need to make those phone calls more often. Get into those chat groups and video calls. Maybe find a friend to walk with and exercise with. You're discovering you really do need more exposure than you've been getting to recover, recharge, and really increase your quality time so that it's better and decrease your stress.